If you had told me 5 years ago that a simple 3-hour drive to a neighboring city would end with me sitting in a dark, unfamiliar basement, staring at a ticking grandfather clock and genuinely wondering if I'd ever see my own apartment again, I would have laughed. I'm the kind of guy who plans everything. I check my tire pressure before long trips, I keep a physical map in the glove box just in case, and I don't take risks. But that's the thing about life, it doesn't care about your plans. It just takes one tiny, insignificant decision, one wrong turn, to completely derail everything and pull you into a situation where you are entirely out of options. My name is Ethan, and at the time I was 28, living in a quiet suburb just outside of Chicago and working as a freelance web designer. It was a comfortable, predictable life. Most of my days were spent staring at lines of code, drinking too much coffee, and dealing with clients over Zoom. Because I worked from home, I rarely went on long drives anymore. So when an old college friend, Marcus, invited me to his wedding in a small, historic town about 4 hours away, I figured it would be a nice change of pace. Just a straightforward weekend trip. A nice hotel, a few drinks, some nostalgia, and then back to my quiet routine. It was a Friday afternoon in late October when I finally hit the road. The weather was typical for autumn, overcast, chilly, with a biting wind that kept tossing dead leaves across the highway. I remember the air in my car smelling like stale coffee and the pine-scented air freshener I'd bought at the gas station an hour earlier. The radio was playing some low-key indie music, and everything felt completely normal. I was making good time, watching the familiar highway signs give way to smaller, two-lane state roads as I moved deeper into the countryside. Around 5:00 p.m., the sky started to turn a heavy, bruised purple. The rain, which had been a light drizzle, suddenly transformed into a torrential downpour. It was the kind of rain that makes your windshield wipers feel completely useless, blurring the headlights of oncoming cars into smeared streaks of white and red. To make matters worse, my GPS completely froze. The little blue arrow on my screen just spun in circles before the signal died completely, leaving me with a blank screen and a searching for network icon. I wasn't too worried at first. I knew the general direction, and I figured if I just kept driving straight, I'd eventually hit a main intersection or a gas station where I could ask for directions. That was my first mistake. Instead of pulling over and waiting out the storm, I kept driving. The road grew narrower, the trees on either side thicker and closer to the asphalt. The asphalt itself had deteriorated, filled with potholes that made my sedan shudder every few seconds. I hadn't seen another car for at least 20 minutes. The realization that I was genuinely lost started as a dull ache in the back of my neck. Then I heard it, a loud, violent metallic thud from the front right side of my car, followed immediately by the rhythmic, heavy flapping sound of a completely shredded tire. I had hit a massive pothole obscured by a deep puddle. Swearing under my breath, I guided the limping car onto the narrow gravel shoulder. I sat there for a moment, the hazards blinking and casting a rhythmic amber glow on the dense woods around me. The rain was drumming furiously on the metal roof. I checked my phone, still no service. 0 bars. Great, just perfect, I muttered to myself. I grabbed my flashlight from the center console, pulled my hood up, and stepped out into the freezing downpour. The wind instantly soaked my jeans and sent a violent shiver down my spine. I walked around to the front passenger side, knelt in the mud, and shone the light on the wheel. It wasn't just a flat tire, the rim was completely bent and warped. Changing it with the cheap donut spare in my trunk on a muddy, sloped shoulder in pitch-black darkness seemed nearly impossible, but I didn't have a choice. As I walked to the back of the car, popped the trunk, and lifted the floor panel, my stomach dropped. The trunk was empty. I suddenly remembered that 3 weeks prior I had taken the spare tire and the jack out to clear space for a massive hauling job for my brother-in-law, and in my rush to prepare for this trip, I had completely forgotten to put them back. I stood there, drenched, freezing, with water dripping from my nose, staring at the empty tire well. I was miles away from any major town on an unknown road with a dead phone, a broken car, and night fast approaching. That was the moment the first wave of real anxiety hit me. It was that cold, heavy feeling in the pit of your stomach when you realize no one is coming to save you. You have to figure it out yourself. I got back into the car, shivering violently, and turned the heater on full blast. I tried to think logically. Walking along the road in this weather in total darkness seemed suicidal. The best option was to stay in the car and wait for morning or hope a passing motorist would see my hazards. But as the clock ticked past 7:00 p.m., the storm only grew worse and not a single car passed. The cold was starting to seep through the glass, and my wet clothes were making it impossible to stay warm. That was when I looked through the passenger window and noticed a faint, flickering yellow light through the thick trees, about 200 yards down a narrow, unpaved driveway I hadn't seen before. It looked like a house. A wave of relief washed over me. A house meant a landline phone. It meant a dry porch, maybe a garage where I could call a tow truck. I grabbed my phone, slipped it into my pocket, locked the car, and began walking down the unpaved path toward the light. The mud clung to my shoes, making every step a struggle. The trees seemed to lean over the path, blocking out whatever faint light was left in the night sky. As I got closer, the shape of the house materialized. It was a large, two-story farmhouse looking worse for wear. The paint was peeling, and one corner of the wrapped porch had sagged significantly. Only one window on the ground floor was illuminated, casting a long, dim shadow across the overgrown front yard. It didn't look particularly welcoming, but to a freezing, stranded driver, it looked like sanctuary. So I walked up the creaking wooden steps of the porch and knocked firmly on the heavy wooden door. The sound echoed inside, swallowed instantly by the roaring wind behind me. I waited. Nothing happened. I knocked again, louder this time, shouting over the rain, "Hello, is anyone home? My car broke down." A few seconds passed, and then I heard the slow, heavy thud of footsteps approaching the door. The lock turned with a loud metallic click. The door opened just a few inches, held by a sturdy brass chain. An eye peered out at me through the crack. It belonged to an elderly man, his face deeply lined with age, with a thick, unkempt gray beard. He looked at me with deep suspicion. "What do you want?" His voice was raspy, dry, like autumn leaves scraping across concrete. "I'm so sorry to bother you, sir," I said, trying to sound as polite and non-threatening as possible, though my teeth were chattering. "My car blew a tire about a quarter-mile up the road. My phone has no service and I don't have a spare. I was hoping I could just use your phone to call a tow truck. I can pay you for the trouble." The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, his eyes moving down to my soaked clothes, my shivering frame, and then back up to my face. The silence stretched on for so long it became uncomfortable. I was just about to apologize and turn away when he finally spoke. "Phones are down. The storm took the lines out an hour ago," he said shortly. My heart sank. "Oh, I see. Do you know how far it is to the nearest gas station?" 6 miles, and you won't make it walking in this rain. The creek is rising over the bridge down the road anyway." He paused, looking past me into the dark woods, then let out a long, heavy sigh. He unlatched the chain. "Come inside before you freeze to death." "Thank you, I really appreciate it," I said, stepping into the warmth of the hallway. The interior of the house smelled old, a mixture of damp wood, wool, and wood smoke. The hallway was dimly lit by a single oil lamp sitting on a side table. There was no electricity. I realized then that the entire house was running on alternative light. "Name's Arthur," the old man said, locking the door securely behind me. He didn't offer his hand. He was wearing an oversized wool flannel shirt and heavy work trousers. Despite his age, he carried himself with a strange, rigid strength. "I'm Ethan," I replied, wiping my boots on the mat. "Follow me," Arthur said, turning and walking down a narrow corridor toward the back of the house. I followed him into a large, cluttered kitchen. A massive wood-burning stove was radiating a comforting, intense heat in the corner. In the center of the room was a heavy oak table covered in old newspapers, tools, and what looked like small mechanical parts from clocks. A single kerosene lantern sat in the middle of the table, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Sit," Arthur ordered, gesturing to a wooden chair. "I'll get you a blanket." I sat down, grateful for the heat. A minute later, he returned with a thick, rough wool blanket and dropped it into my lap. I wrapped it around my shoulders, feeling the warmth slowly returning to my limbs. Arthur sat down opposite me, picked up a small screwdriver, and began working on a brass gear from some mechanism, completely ignoring me. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the wood stove and the furious lashing of the rain against the kitchen window. I felt awkward, out of place, but incredibly grateful. "Do you live here alone, Arthur?" I asked, trying to break the ice. He didn't look up from his work. "Mostly." "It's a big place to maintain by yourself," I added. "I manage," he said, his tone flat and uninviting. "It's okay, so he wasn't a talker. That was fine. I decided to just sit quietly and wait out the worst of the storm. My plan was to wait until early morning, walk the 6 miles to the gas station if the rain let up, and get a tow. It was going to be a long, uncomfortable night, but manageable. About an hour passed. My clothes were mostly dry now, and the intense heat from the stove was making me incredibly drowsy. My eyes were heavy, and I found myself drifting off, my chin dropping to my chest. I awoke with a sudden start. The kitchen was colder now, the fire in the stove having died down to embers. The kerosene lamp on the table was burning low, flickering weakly. Arthur was no longer sitting across from me. His chair was empty, the tools neatly arranged on the newspapers. I blinked, trying to clear the sleep from my eyes. I checked my phone. It was 10:45 p.m., still no service. "Arthur," I called out softly. No response. I stood up, the wool blanket slipping from my shoulders. The house was completely silent except for a strange, faint sound coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards. It was a rhythmic, metallic scraping sound followed by a dull thud, scrape, thud, scrape, thud. A sudden unease crept over me. It wasn't the kind of sound a house makes when it settles. It sounded deliberate. As I walked out of the kitchen and back into the dark hallway, the oil lamp that had been on the side table was gone. I used the flashlight feature on my phone, keeping the beam low so as not to draw attention. The scraping sound grew louder as I walked toward the back of the hallway, leading to a door that was slightly ajar. I pushed the door open gently. It led to a steep flight of wooden stairs going down into a basement. The air coming up from the basement was icy, smelling strongly of earth, rust, and something else, something metallic and sharp that made my throat tighten. The scraping sound was definitely coming from down there. So I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I just turn around, go to the front door and leave? I should have. But my car keys were in my pocket, my car was broken, and I was in the middle of nowhere in a storm. I needed to know if Arthur was doing something that put me in danger or if he just needed help. I crept down the stairs, stepping carefully on the edges of the steps to prevent them from creaking. The basement was large, illuminated by several lanterns hung from the wooden beams above. The floor was poured concrete, but it was covered in layers of dust and dirt. At the far end of the basement, with his back to me, was Arthur. He was standing next to a large, rectangular wooden crate that looked like an old shipping container. He was using a heavy iron crowbar to pry open the lid. Scrape, thud. But that wasn't what caught my attention. What made my breath catch in my throat, what made my entire body freeze in absolute terror, was what was sitting on a heavy workbench just a few feet away from him. Laid out neatly on a clean white cloth were three large military-grade hunting knives, a roll of heavy-duty duct tape, several pairs of thick zip ties, and a large plastic container labeled chloroform. Next to these items were three distinct wallets open with driver's licenses clearly visible. Even from 10 feet away, I could see the faces on the licenses weren't Arthur. They were young men roughly my age. One of the licenses had a bright red X scratched into the plastic face. My mind raced, violently piecing together the reality of the situation. The isolated road, the bent rim from a pothole that might not have been accidental, the lack of a phone line, the intense, uncomfortable scrutiny when he first opened the door, the strange silence. This man wasn't a grumpy hermit. He was a predator, and I had walked right into his den. As Arthur gave one final, powerful heave on the crowbar, the wooden lid of the crate popped open with a loud, splintering sound. He dropped the crowbar onto the concrete floor. It clanged loudly, the sound echoing through the basement. He leaned over, looking into the crate, and muttered something I couldn't understand. Then he reached over to the workbench, his hand hovering over the zip ties. I knew I had to get out of there immediately. I turned around to sprint up the stairs, but in my blind panic, my foot caught the edge of a loose piece of old linoleum flooring near the base of the steps. As I stumbled, my shoulder slamming hard against a metal shelving unit filled with old paint cans. The cans rattled violently, and one small can of WD-40 tipped over, falling to the concrete floor with a sharp, echoing clack. The scraping sound stopped instantly. Complete, suffocating silence filled the basement. I didn't look back. I didn't wait to see Arthur's reaction. I scrambled up the wooden stairs as fast as my legs could carry me, abandoning any attempt at stealth. I burst through the basement door, slammed it shut behind me, and ran down the dark hallway toward the front door. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it felt painful. My hands were shaking violently as I reached for the heavy brass lock on the front door. I grabbed the knob and twisted it. Oh, it didn't budge. I gripped the deadbolt turnpiece and tried to twist it, but it wouldn't move. I flashed my phone light on the lock. My stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. It wasn't a standard thumb-turn deadbolt. It was a double-cylinder lock, the kind that requires a physical key from both the outside and the inside to open. And the key was gone. "No, no, no, please," I whispered, tears of pure panic stinging my eyes. I yanked on the handle, throwing my weight against the solid oak door, but it didn't even shake. It was like trying to push through a brick wall. Behind me, from the end of the hallway, I heard the basement door open. The heavy, rhythmic thud of Arthur's footsteps began approaching. They weren't rushed. They were slow, deliberate, confident. He knew I was trapped. He knew there was nowhere for me to go. "Ethan," Arthur's voice boomed down the dark hallway, completely devoid of the fragile, old man raspy quality it had earlier. It sounded cold, commanding, and terrifyingly calm. "You shouldn't have gone down there." I didn't answer. I looked around wildly in the darkness. To my left was the living room, completely black. To my right was the dining room. At the end of the hall, the footsteps were getting closer. He was 20 feet away, 10 feet away. I darted into the living room, slipping behind a heavy velvet curtain that covered a large bay window. I pressed my back against the cold glass, holding my breath, my entire body trembling so hard I thought he would hear my bones rattling. As I looked at the window lock, it was painted shut with decades of thick white enamel. Even if I broke the glass, the heavy wooden frame had decorative iron bars on the outside. I was entirely boxed in. Through the small gap in the curtains, I saw the beam of a flashlight enter the living room. The light swept across the old furniture, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. "I've been doing this a long time, Ethan," Arthur said, his voice closer now, coming from just inside the living room entryway. "People get lost out here. The roads are bad. The storm always helps. Nobody looks for a car that gets swallowed by the creek. By morning, your car will be in the river bed and you'll be gone. It's clean, it's simple." The flashlight beam swept closer to the window. It illuminated the edge of the velvet curtain just inches from my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying, bargaining with whatever higher power was listening. I had never felt so utterly helpless. My intelligence, my planning, my technical skills, none of it mattered here. I was just prey in a dark room. The flashlight beam stopped directly on the curtain. "I know you're in here," Arthur whispered. I heard the faint, distinct snick of a knife blade flicking open. In that moment of absolute blinding terror, something snapped inside me. The paralyzing fear turned into a desperate, primal urge to survive. I realized that if I stayed behind that curtain, I was dead. My only advantage was that he didn't know exactly which panel I was behind, and he expected me to be cowering. As the footsteps took one more step toward the curtain, I didn't wait. I grabbed the heavy wooden curtain rod above me with both hands and yanked downward with all my weight. With a loud, crashing, splintering sound, the drywall gave way. The massive, heavy wooden rod and yards of thick, heavy velvet fabric collapsed directly onto Arthur, burying him beneath a mountain of heavy cloths. He let out a muffled shout of rage and surprise, stumbling backward under the unexpected weight. I didn't hesitate. I lunged out from behind the falling fabric, using the momentum to throw my entire body weight into a tackle. My shoulder hit his chest hard. We both went flying backward, crashing into a low glass coffee table. The glass shattered with a deafening explosion, sharp shards cutting through my jeans and into my hands. Arthur groaned, the wind knocked out of him, but his grip on the knife didn't loosen. He swung blindly through the fabric, the blade slicing through the air just inches from my throat. As I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, ignoring the agonizing sting of glass embedding into my palms, I saw his flashlight rolling across the floor, illuminating the entryway to the kitchen. I bolted for it. As I ran into the kitchen, my mind working at 1,000,000 miles an hour, the back door. There had to be a back door in the kitchen. As I found it next to the pantry, I grabbed the handle and pulled. Locked. Another double-cylinder lock, no key. "Damn it," I screamed, a sob escaping my throat. Behind me, I heard Arthur rising from the living room floor, throwing the heavy curtains aside. His heavy boots thudded against the hardwood, moving toward the kitchen. He was pissed now. The calm, predatory demeanor was gone, replaced by heavy, angry breathing. I looked around the kitchen wildly. My eyes landed on the massive wood-burning stove. Next to it was a heavy cast-iron poker used for shifting logs. It was about 3 feet long, thick and solid. I grabbed the iron poker, my bloody hands slipping slightly on the cold metal. I stepped into the shadows next to the kitchen door frame, pressing my back against the wall, holding the poker high above my shoulder like a baseball bat. The footsteps reached the kitchen threshold. Arthur stepped into the room, the flashlight in his left hand, the long hunting knife glinting in his right. His face was scratched from the broken glass, his eyes wide with a manic, murderous fury. He didn't see me in the shadow behind the door. He looked straight ahead toward the locked back door. As he took one step past me, I swung the cast-iron poker with every single ounce of strength I had left in my body. The heavy iron bar connected squarely with the side of his knee. A sickening, loud crack echoed through the kitchen, followed by a guttural, agonizing shriek of pain from Arthur. His leg buckled completely, and he collapsed heavily onto the floor, dropping the flashlight and the knife. He clutched his shattered knee, rolling in agony, screaming curses into the dark room. As I didn't try to hit him again, I didn't try to play the hero. I dropped the poker, scooped up the dropped flashlight, and sprinted back out of the kitchen, through the hallway, and straight down into the basement. I knew he had the keys on him, but I wasn't going to risk wrestling a desperate man with a knife for them. I remembered the heavy iron crowbar he had dropped on the concrete floor near the crate. I flew down the basement stairs, grabbed the heavy iron crowbar, and ran back up. My legs felt like lead, my lungs burning, the adrenaline the only thing keeping me upright. As I reached the top of the stairs, I could hear Arthur dragging himself across the kitchen floor, his breath ragged, his screams turning into wet, angry gasps. As I ran to the front door, I wedged the flat, curved end of the crowbar into the gap between the solid oak door and the heavy wooden frame, right next to the deadbolt. As I leaned on the crowbar, putting all my weight, all my terror, all my desire to see my family again into that single lever, the wood began to groan and splinter. "Come on," I screamed, my muscles tearing under the strain. From the end of the hallway, I saw Arthur emerge from the kitchen. He was crawling on his stomach, dragging his useless, broken leg behind him, the hunting knife still gripped tightly in his hand. He was pulling himself forward with terrifying speed, his eyes locked on me like a demon. "Lythan," he roared, a spraying cough of blood escaping his lips. As I gave one final, desperate, violent heave on the crowbar, with a sound like a gunshot, the heavy oak frame split entirely. The deadbolt ripped out of the wood and the door flew open, slamming against the outside wall. The freezing, beautiful rain swept into the hallway. I dropped the crowbar, turned, and sprinted out into the night. I didn't look back. I ran down the muddy driveway, my shoes slipping, falling once into the mud, scrambling back up and running until I hit the main road. I didn't stop at my car. I knew it was useless. I just started running down the dark asphalt road, heading in the opposite direction of the house, the torrential rain washing the blood and mud from my hands. As I ran for what felt like hours, my mind completely blank, operating purely on survival instinct. Eventually, about 2 miles down the road, the piercing bright headlights of a massive vehicle appeared through the rain. It was a county highway snowplow clearing debris from the storm. As I threw my arms up, screaming and waving frantically in the middle of the road, the massive truck hissed to a halt, its yellow-amber lights flashing. The driver, a large man in a high-visibility jacket, opened the door, looking at me in utter shock. I was a bloody, muddy, shivering wreck. "Hey, buddy, what happened to you?" he shouted over the engine roar. "Call the police," I gasped, collapsing against the side of the truck, my legs finally giving out completely. "Please, call the police. There's a man in the house down the road. He tried to kill me." The next 12 hours are a blur of flashing blue lights, sterile hospital rooms, and endless questions from detectives. They found my car where I left it. And when a SWAT team breached Arthur's farmhouse early that morning, they found him still on the kitchen floor, unable to move due to his shattered patella. But what they found in the basement made national news. The large wooden crate I had seen him opening contained personal belongings, driver's licenses, clothing, and phones belonging to 5 different young men who had gone missing in that tri-state area over the last 6 years. All of them had experienced vehicular trouble on that specific stretch of state road during bad weather. Arthur had been placing heavy, sharp iron spikes in the deep potholes during storms, waiting like a spider for someone to blow a tire. I was supposed to be number 6. It's been a few years since that night. Arthur is currently serving multiple consecutive life sentences in a maximum security facility where he will undoubtedly die. My physical wounds healed quickly. The scars on my hands from the broken glass are faint silver lines now, barely noticeable unless you look closely. But the psychological scars took much longer. For a long time, I couldn't drive at night. I couldn't drive in the rain. Every time I heard a loud thud while driving over a bump, my heart rate would spike and a cold sweat would break out across my forehead. I went to therapy for a year to handle the PTSD. As I still plan my trips and I still keep a spare tire in my trunk, I check it every single week now. But that night taught me something fundamental about the world, something that no amount of planning can ever truly prepare you for. We like to believe we are completely in control of our lives. We create routines, we build safety nets, and we convince ourselves that bad things only happen to people who make bad choices. But the truth is, safety is an illusion. The boundary between a perfectly normal, boring Friday afternoon and a fight for your absolute survival is incredibly thin. Sometimes all it takes is a wrong turn, a missed detail, and a rainstorm to show you exactly what you're made of when you have absolutely nothing left to lose.